Let's review adding and subtracting fractions. So there's certain things we want to keep in mind when we're adding and subtracting fractions. One is that the denominator does not change. We only add or subtract the numerators, but we need to have common denominators. We may need to find equivalent fractions and write equivalent fractions to get those common denominators. So let's sum that up. So we must have common denominators. We want to keep the denominator the same. And add or subtract only the numerators. And lastly, we may need to write equivalent fractions to get those common denominators. We usually find our common denominator by finding something called the lowest common denominator. It is not always necessary, however. You can always simplify your fractions as you work through them. So we want to keep all of those things in mind as we go through our examples. So our first example is fairly straightforward. We have 1/5 plus 2/5. Now we want to keep our denominators the same and only add or subtract our numerators. So this is going to give us 3/5 as our final answer. Let's try one that's a little bit more challenging. We have 1/10 minus 4/5. So in this case, we don't have common denominators. So we need to make sure we get a common denominator before we add or subtract. So here we need to rewrite with a common denominator. And in this case, our lowest common denominator is 10, because we can do 5 times 2 and easily get to 10. And in order to get to that 10, what we need to do is multiply our entire fraction of 4/5 by the equivalent of 1. And I'm going to write that down and then show you what that means. So what we're going to do is we are going to take our 4/5 and we need to change it into a fraction that has a denominator of 10. But we don't want to change the value. We still want it to be equivalent to 4/5. So we are going to multiply 4/5 by 2 over 2. Now, any number over itself, or in this case, you can think of it as division, right? 2 divided by 2, because that's what a fraction is equivalent to 1. So in this case, we are multiplying by the equivalent of 1 here when we are multiplying by 2 over 2. So it's going to change the numerator and the denominator, but it's not going to change the value. So now we have 1/10 minus 8/10 because we did our multiplication. And 1 minus 8 gives us -7. We end up with -7/10 as our final answer. Let's do one more. Okay, our third example. Let's say we have 1/2 plus 1/3 minus 1/4. Now, quickly looking at this, you might think, oh, it's going to take me a while to find that lowest common denominator, and it might. So if you can't easily find the lowest common denominator right away, what you can do is multiply all of the denominators together to get a common denominator. So we are going to multiply all of our denominators together here. So 2 times 3 times 4, and that's going to give us 24. So 24 can be our common denominator. So now what we need to think of, though, is what do we need to multiply each of these fractions by in order to get that denominator of 12? So we have to multiply 1 over 2 by something, 1 over 3 by something, and 1 over 4 by something. Now, they do not all need to be the same fraction or the same equivalent of 1. So in our first fraction, we have 1 over 2, and we want our denominator to be 4. So we need to multiply 2 by 12 to get 24. Sorry, I think I said denominator of 4. So we are going to multiply by 12 over 12. That is an equivalent of 1, and 2 times 12 gives us 24. We're going to go to 1/3 and do the same thing. We can multiply 3 by 8 to get 24. So we are going to multiply 1/3 by 8 over 8. And lastly, we have 1 over 4, and we can multiply 4 by 6 to get 24. So we're going to multiply -1/4 by 6 over 6. Okay, so let's actually do all this multiplication. So we are going to end up with 12 over 24 plus 8 over 24 minus 6 over 24. So now we want to do all of our addition and subtraction, and we are going to end up with 14 over 24. Now, we are not finished though, because we need to simplify and write in lowest terms. So we must always simplify and write our final answer in lowest terms. And 14 and 24 are both even numbers, so we can divide them both by 2. And we end up with 7/12 as our final answer.